on ground floor activation of mixed-use projects. Graffito's work spans from project inception to completion and exists at the intersection of retail leasing, neighborhood strategy, urban design, and branding. At Graffito, Corey leads the growing urban design practice that is complementary to the firm's core belief that urban neighborhoods will be more valuable, sustainable, and usable when ground floor uses are carefully designed, coordinated, and executed. Working at all scales, she provides leadership and expertise during early phase strategic planning. Corey, take it away. We'll give you control of the slideshow.
Great. So give me a second so I can just share screen, and then hopefully it'll all work. So I'm going to start the slide share. Can you guys see that?
We can, yes.
Just to the single slide, right? Right. Okay, great. So thank you, John, for that lovely introduction. And also thank you for, you wanted to say something. Yes.
Sorry, Corey. The video seems, at least on my screen, it seems to be a little, can you go either full screen or something, but we can't quite see the slide as well as we probably should be able to.
Is that true for everybody? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let me try something else then, actually.
There you go.
Yeah, you're seeing it now though, not, let me actually try. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. Does that work? Is that good?
We can see the slide.
That's better than it was before, for sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, better than before, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So I can't see myself. This is what happens though, is that, am I frozen now?
We still see the first slide.
Do you see me though? Am I frozen?
We hear you, we do not see you.
Okay. Okay, well, maybe that's better in a way. Normally when I'm doing these panels, I can only see myself and none of you. And frankly, after doing all these Zoom calls, I'm so sick of looking at myself and so self-conscious looking at myself. So I prefer to actually see friendly faces. So that's fine. Let's just look at the slides. And you know, I was just starting to say thank you for the invitation. You know, I am very flattered that you asked me. There's a lot of people doing interesting work out there, so I was delighted to receive the invitation. And you know, I've been working from home since March, probably like many of you. I have a 2- and 4-year-old, so I am teetering on the edge of sanity at all times. So I welcome any distraction that's sort of a change in the norm. And you know, as I was thinking about this presentation today, I was actually reflecting that it was exactly 1 year ago, I was teaching a studio. I actually taught an architecture and urban design studio at the GSD with Eric Howler, whom you might know of, called Adapting Miami, Housing Along the Transect. And we had actually appropriated the transect concept from the new Urbanists, and we took the students down to Miami, where we went to the CNU mothership. We took everyone to DPC to meet with Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, where we had a great engaging conversation about Miami zoning, among other things. And then, you know, it was actually the very last flight I took, which was late February of this year, was back down to Miami to sort of present on the studio to the Knight Foundation, who had underwritten the studio. And that was, you know, the last time I've left Boston. And so I feel somehow it's maybe destiny, maybe that's too strong of a word, to again have CNU be prompting me to think about our urban future, although our world has changed substantially in that time. So thank you for that invitation. You know, I don't think though that it is the studio, which is the reason why you asked me to speak. In fact, I know it's not. I think the reason you asked me to speak, which John quickly touched on in my bio, is the perspective I have of working in both the public and private sectors. You know, I spent time in the private sector working as a sort of planning and urban design professional before spending 6 years at the Boston Planning and Development Agency. And recently I've gone back again to the private sector. And I think what the pandemic has made very clear to me is that, you know, there's not going to be one set of actors that's going to decide the future or the outcome, you know, of our cities. it's really going to be all hands on deck. And I think cities have been pushed in uncomfortable ways, productively uncomfortable ways. I think private actors have been pushed in productively uncomfortable ways. But, you know, that's going to ultimately play a role in what the future looks like in our cities. So I know that 1,000%, but I don't know precisely what the future is. So spoiler alert, I know I'm supposed to be talking about what the future holds, but I don't think I have any clear-cut answers. So, you know, that was just a little bit of a preamble. I did want to just take a moment also to reflect on this title. Full disclosure, this was a title that was given to me by John or by one of you. And, you know, I contemplated for a moment changing it, and I decided not to for 3 reasons. The first is that it was sufficiently vague as to allow me to talk about sort of whatever the hell it is I wanted to talk about. And I'm choosing to talk about predominantly our ground floor spaces, both interior and exterior. And that's great. Number 2 was the choice of not singular future, but plural futures, right? That there are, the title suggests there's not one, but many possible futures ahead of us. So I think that is also especially poignant given that we're on the eve of a national election. And I would urge you all to obviously vote if you haven't already. I'm, I think, the only person in America that's planning to vote on election day. But that is my plan and I'm sticking to it. But I do think there are many, many possible futures, and we're still, I wouldn't say in the early innings, but I would say we're sort of maybe midway through the pandemic. And then the last is the inclusion of the word urban. And, you know, this is actually a quote from myself. So I'm using one of my own quotes, but this was, I think back in April, my Graffito colleagues and I were sort of responding to the fact that, if you recall, there were this spate of articles that were essentially predicting doomsday for cities, right, and urbanity, that somehow density in our cities were the culprit for, you know, the massive number of COVID cases. And, you know, I just felt that even in that moment, if we consider the arc of history, you know, people always return to cities. And, you know, that is continued to be true. I think now, you know, you probably all now familiar with these maps that the New York Times sort of updates every day. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, but also fortunately for that argument, you know, the coronavirus has now made its way across the entire country to both our urban, suburban, and rural communities. So, you know, it was a little bit premature to sort of decry urbanity. So I remain bullish, and, you know, my Graffito colleagues and I do double down. What is, though, I think difficult to know is the timetable for recovery. And we can't really speculate on that, but the steadfast commitment to cities and urban places where you can rub elbows and make sparks will endure. So, you know, I do think, though, it's worth acknowledging that we are still in the midst of a crisis, and it's likely to be painful for some time. So people have seen a lot of charts. This one I've been showing because it is really interesting. The black dot that you see on the, yeah?
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Unfortunately, the slide that I see is still the first slide.
Oh, really?
Or that, yeah.
Is that true for everyone? Yeah, okay, well.
Oh, there we go.
You see it now?
I see it now, yeah, you just did, yeah.
Okay, well, I might just try this tactic. So this was the quote. So in the context of what I was just saying, I wish somebody had told me sooner, but this is my quote, that there have been a lot of articles speculating whether this crisis will result in people leaving cities, but if we take the long view and consider the arc of history, people always come back. And then here's that map that I was just describing that shows now the sort of per capita cases across the United States. So cities, suburban and rural areas are all sort of vulnerable. So this is the point about, you know, sort of the state of the crisis that we're in now. The black dot that you see there, that is Deer Island. And people might not be aware, but since actually the beginning of March, there is a company that's been doing thrice weekly testing for wastewater for indicators of infection of COVID-19. And so Deer Island Wastewater Treatment Plant is actually the second largest sewage treatment facility in the United States. It collects wastewater from 43 cities and towns in eastern Massachusetts. And the graph on the left, what you're seeing there is that spike on the right-hand side is from the past couple of weeks, and it's showing a spike in rates of infection that we haven't seen since April. And so this is a leading indicator of the state of the coronavirus in eastern Massachusetts, and one that's really alarming. So just to say, when we're talking about the future of our urban spaces, you know, I think it's still too soon to say sort of precisely what the future looks like, given that we're still in the midst of it. You know, this is the third wave, and it is going to be a long and likely painful winter, which I know is a little bit pessimistic, but is just sort of the reality. But remember, I just said I'm optimistic on cities in the long term. I also feel that it's important to just sort of acknowledge the other variable that I think is going to have a critical impact on the future. I know Lydia Edwards was also supposed to speak this afternoon and was going to touch on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I wasn't going to talk as much about it today, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least acknowledge this. You know, and I also want to say I appreciate the decision to have two women, one of color, featured as part of your annual summit. And I know that, you know, Lydia has probably been often asked to speak as a spokesperson, but this is something that we've been talking a lot about, Graffito, and we're taking it very seriously to figure out how we can be better advocates and champions for Black and brown businesses and for racial equality in development through concrete actions. But you know, we have to recognize, as you know, Matt and Jacinda were just saying, the planning profession has played a notorious role in sort of the structural racism of cities. And it's an understatement to say too that it's going to take enormous effort to create equity in cities. So I'm using this image. You've probably seen the one in DC that says Black Lives Matter leading up to the Capitol. This one's a little closer to home. It's in Worcester. This is sort of related to a project we were working on. It's the brainchild of Shay Anderson, who's the Deputy Cultural Development Officer for the city of Worcester, and also Powwow Worcester, which is a worldwide mural project. And they commissioned 16 Black artists, one for each letter, to design a letter to be painted on the street. And I think the point is that obviously it's incredibly powerful to use public space to make a political statement, but it should also be in combination with creating opportunities for BIPOC entrepreneurs to own and operate businesses adjacent to that space. So, you know, we at Graffito, we talk about the importance of local, but going forward, I think DEI issues are going to be increasingly threshold to not only how we approach projects, but how we choose our clients and our partners. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to talk primarily about ground floor uses, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't at least acknowledge some of the amazing innovations that have been happening in the public realm. And this is also a quote from me from one of the blog posts I wrote, which is basically talking about how there was a sort of creative proliferation of adaptations and innovations to our streetscapes and our sidewalks. And this has been incubating for some time, probably no surprise to anybody on this call or on this Zoom, but the coronavirus really, I would say, expedited that. And so you're all obviously familiar with the explosion in outdoor dining, from the very, very temporary to the more permanent. You see also too, more recently, the things like outdoor space heaters and the sort of igloos or pods as the weather gets colder. You know, I think this is also just the beginning, and many cities have adapted their ordinances to extend outdoor dining, which is probably long overdue. We also see, you know, more creative use of open space for active and passive recreation. Actually, just going back for a second, you know, it's worth noting that prior to the pandemic, the real hurdle in having outdoor dining space, which many of you may know, but not everyone, is that it was required to be contiguous with your premises. And just that was very difficult for people. It was a legal requirement. And so the city needed to figure out, the obvious space is obviously the space on the sidewalk, on the street. It wasn't always contiguous, but really even also expand that to think about vacant municipal lots or underutilized parking lots. Similarly, I think people have obviously flocked to open spaces and parks just to get outside. And, it has also been challenging for cities, I think, to figure out how they can let fitness operators generate revenue from public space. But, I think that they're doing that work now. In talking with some of my city colleagues, they recognize that there's a demand, and so trying to work with private entities to be able to figure that out. But, this shouldn't be surprising to anybody. Like I say, it's kind of probably your religion, and it's nice to see these open spaces getting as much use. And lastly, shared streets. Again, these have been in the works for some time, but I think COVID kind of pushed them over the edge. Many of these are actually taken nearby in Somerville and in Cambridge. So good work, George. So, I'm going to, though, as I say, focus a lot on the ground floor. And I'm going to start with what is the obvious retail uses, which are restaurants and shops. And very early on in the pandemic, this was in March, April, and May, I was writing a column that I called Restaurant Retrofits, where I was actually going to the restaurants to see how they were reconfiguring or retrofitting their spaces during the time of the pandemic. And out of that, I made an initial list of observations. I'll call these almost proto-predictions about the future, some of which have endured until today. But my goal is to ultimately get to what we're called the non-retail ground floor active uses. I know that's a mouthful again. But restaurants are what everybody thinks of. So what are my top 10 observations from these columns? Number one, greater storefront porosity. The more doors, the better. It was really, really useful if you wanted to have a one-way flow through a property, if you were sort of picking up as a customer, to be able to go in one door and out the other. The other real need for having multiple doors was having a dedicated door for sort of pickup and delivery drivers. Number two was the creative explosion of floor supergraphics and environmental wayfinding. I say now we're sort of entering the golden era of environmental graphics on the ground. Just in the past couple of months, they're everywhere. I mean, it's impossible to go somewhere and not see them. Number three is what I call the twofer, which is the fact that, restaurants were really hurting as a way to sort of make up some of the revenue. Many of them had to hybridize with another use. So the restaurant and market or the restaurant and meal plan were some of the most typical pivots that happened during those early months. And it allowed them, frankly, to stay alive before the summer dining kicked in. And what's interesting to note is that was also a trend we saw before COVID happened, but I think really accelerated some of the hybridization. Number four is what I'll call the aesthetic refinement of contactless pickup, which is related to number five of embracing technology. Before COVID, if you were picking up, it was kind of messy. You didn't really know exactly where to go. I mean, Sweetgreen had kind of figured this out, but not too many other people. And since then, I think a lot of people have figured out how to expedite it. It's no longer just, some masking tape sort of directing people where to go. And part of that is a function of embracing technology so that there doesn't need to be, sort of credit card exchange. Everything can be done in a contactless manner. And the restaurants that have embraced this technology have really managed to survive. I'm not going to go through all these, it's going to take too long, and I think some of these are obvious in terms of staff care, a sort of desire to return to comfort food. If you look actually at restaurants, fast casual has really done extraordinarily well compared to fine dining, which has done abysmally. But the last one is, changes to the public realm. Almost immediately, the restaurant premises needed to move outside to give people an indication from the storefront, using the sidewalk and the streetscape infrastructure to give an indication to customers to help build trust about what the protocol would look like. So, you know, now I'm going to shift to some broader trends that go beyond just the restaurants. And, you know, first by saying that, you know, there are a set of ingredients for a good place, and nothing on this list is going to surprise anyone. And I think this is true before COVID, it's going to be true after COVID, but there are some additional ingredients that are going to make a good place in the era of COVID. The first is residential density. You know, the shops and the establishments that are doing the best, and frankly, you know, the sidewalks that show the most signs of life are in some of our residential Main Street neighborhoods. They're not in downtown Boston. And if you go to downtown, I don't know if any of you have been there recently, I occasionally have to go, it is sort of eerily quiet and the streets are comparatively empty. And that's just due to a lack of residential density. Whereas, you know, I was talking to the director of small business for the city of Boston, Natalia Turby, and she says, you know, by and large, based on the limited data they've received, that, you know, retail establishments located in the neighborhoods are faring better than the ones located downtown. You know, for a while, I don't know what the numbers are now, but it was single-digit occupancy in terms of the office users. And that just doesn't create the density to really support those retail establishments. The second is what I call curbside management and vehicular centricity. You know, I am all for walkable urbanism. That is my religion. But curbside management becomes very, very important in the era of COVID. And this is a shift away from TNC, so like transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, which predominantly was what the curb was needing to be managed around, to now thinking about, again, pickup and delivery drivers around food, and also loading, which is also very critical. Ironically, you know, spaces before COVID were getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and now as we need to spatially distance, we need actually more space, both inside and outside. I already mentioned public realm signage and sort of environmental graphics. Communications through technology, also really important, and then supply chain. You know, everybody went to go buy their space heaters at exactly the same time, and that obviously it makes it challenging for restaurants to continue to operate during the cooler months. And then this is a little bit too much information, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. This is retail trends pre-COVID and post-COVID. Some of the things I was just mentioning before in terms of space needs. You know, if we're thinking about urban spaces, it's again, these sort of like smaller spaces, but in the near term, we need more space to accommodate spatial distancing, the need for more prep and storage space, a shift to delivery model, et cetera. But we also need operable storefronts. So I do think in the future, we're going to see very different designs to our storefronts that can open and close. You know, outdoor space went from being a nice to have to having a must have, essentially, having multiple egress doors and HVAC retrofits. This is a way to sort of build trust with the clientele. And then big picture, you know, graphics and wayfinding are absolutely critical. Planning for the curb is critical. I mentioned local being very important, but really diversity, equity, inclusion becoming a new lens, which shoppers will be evaluating when they make their decisions about where they're going to go and spend their money. And then, as I already mentioned, central business districts and downtown are hardest hit. So in summary, this is, you know, not a whole lot of great news for the near term. You know, spring was really bad. Winter is going to be really, really bad. You know, malls and central business districts have been hit particularly hard. Food and beverage, we're seeing widespread closures, and some are even opting to hibernate, which essentially means they are shutting down operations until the spring. They've sort of negotiated with their landlord because they're losing more money by staying open. You know, I won't go through all of these, but, you know, it's in the near term going to be very challenging. So I know I'm being a little bit of a Debbie Downer, but I also just think it's sort of realistic that we say it's going to be bad, but let's use this as an opportunity. And I think that, there is going to be so much pent up demand. People are going to want to go back to shops and to restaurants, but obviously it needs to be done in a safe manner. In A locations, there's always going to be a need for quality retail. But I think that we need to take a step back and say, what are we doing with our ground floor spaces across the city if we can't support retail everywhere? So this leads me to sort of what I wanted to most talk about, which are non-retail ground floor active uses. Because as I was just saying, before COVID, there was already an oversupply of retail. And going forward, we're just not going to have the same kind of demand. So if it's not going to be retail, then what is it going to be? So I'm just going to sort of get into this list. So, many of these things are not new to you, but even if they aren't new, they probably are changed in some way by COVID, which I will try to note. I think some people might be critical, that this isn't going to generate a lot of revenue, but at Graffito, we've always taken the position that your ground floor use is not necessarily a mechanism to drive revenue, but rather a way to create value. And as I mentioned, I think restaurants and traditional retail establishments are not going to be faring so well in the near term. So we have to think about alternative uses if we still want an active streetscape, which is the thing that I think people do want, even in these sort of residential Main Street neighborhoods. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Just to say one thing, I think that the obvious issue related to all of this is zoning. I think that it just needs to be less prescriptive about what's allowed by right as a ground floor use. And this is the moment to challenge what's been acceptable. And I think cities will be responsive. I know that Boston has, they were before COVID, and I think they're especially so now, but I know that is sort of the limiting factor. And so we are going to have to look at what zoning allows in terms of ground floor use. So arts and recreation, this includes galleries and studios. In light of COVID, many galleries have had to get creative with moving beyond the traditional white cube. They now offer digital means via pre-recorded broadcast, live stream, augmented reality apps, or social media. This creates still something beautiful to look at, frankly, on the ground floor rather than just an empty storefront. Kids, we were talking about this before we officially started. Some kids are back in school, some kids are not. I think there's a dire need to have spaces for kids these days for families who want to feel comfortable using them, and also studio space. With dance studios, I think that, group classes are probably not happening anytime soon, but there has been an increase in individual training or virtual training in some of these studios, which is, again, still bringing some kind of use to these studio spaces, and that's increasing in popularity. Maker and fabricator, these are spaces that, are already seeing an increase in popularity. But I think we'll continue to do so. See a robotic studio, shared tool workspace. Podcast and recording studio. This is, very interesting given that we are all now sort of conducting our meetings by Zoom. So being able to be in a sort of soundproof protected area is now desirable. We actually at Graffito, this is an interesting side note, we're not using our office, and we converted it into a podcast studio. I don't know if anybody is a listener out there. This is a plug. We just wrapped our first season, 8 episodes. Since we're not in the office, we decided to convert it to a podcast studio. And I think that there's a need now for people to be able to record information, or even just have Zoom calls where they don't have kids or animals sort of jumping in the background. You know, this is actually a new use, but I think experts all agree that COVID testing is what's going to get us back to semi-normal more quickly. And as we move into colder weather and have the capacity to self-administer tests, this becomes a great temporary use. You know, most of the COVID tests have been set up, you know, in outdoor spaces and parking lots, but as we move into the colder months, this is also a consideration, along with some medical uses. You know, these have historically been buried in the upper floors in the building, but are increasingly migrating to the ground floor for convenience and for safety. And along those same lines, I think creative office is something that's also well suited to the ground floor for some similar reasons. You know, employees don't want to get in an elevator. And you used to be paying a premium for being on the top floor of a building. And now I think employees actually want to be on the ground floor where they can enter their offices without having to encounter too many other people. So I also included Graffito's office. I don't know what I was wearing that day. You can see me in the window. But like I said, we chose a storefront location for our office. And since we're not there, we've decided to repurpose it into something that is also a little bit more active. And then lastly, you know, civic uses. This is something that is also not new. It's been pioneered in Boston, I think very successfully in New York City in terms of libraries and schools being on the ground floor of larger commercial, but especially multifamily buildings. And in Boston, there's something called Housing Over Public Assets, which is a relatively new program that's looking at redeveloping lower density sites with civic programs that are in need of redevelopment to get a sort of newer facility, but at the same time increase density. And these are obviously very active uses. So I think still very desirable for neighborhoods and bring a lot of foot traffic beyond, again, your traditional restaurant and store. And similarly, community teen centers, food banks, and urban grocers. I think actually some of these pictures got carried over from before. So, you know, I wanted to leave on a more hopeful note, you know, which is thinking more creatively about some of these uses, which can, I think, successfully activate the ground floor of our neighborhoods and our downtowns, given that we might not have the same demand for restaurants and cafes in the short term. But again, in the long term, I remain optimistic about the future of our cities. And again, I would just urge you all to go vote.
Thank you, Corey. That was interesting. I was very inspired by the presentation. I'm sure the group was as well. So thank you very much for that presentation. Very exciting. You know, as a developer, I'll ask you a question just to kick things off. To me, this rethinking of retail space and ground floor uses, I mean, this really could be over the next, I don't know, 5+ years, could be as important to us as urbanists. I don't want to say as important as affordable housing, but it's one of the similar, very important. How do we find ways to reuse and activate these spaces? And I really appreciate that last slide with some of the different, last series of slides with some of those different ideas. Are you seeing, just as a general question, how is business? Are you seeing business with the developers that you're working with? Is it slowing down in the downtowns and picking up further out in the suburbs, or is it pretty steady? I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit more about that landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think that, you know, Graffito's business has two sides. On one side, we have the advisory, which is really the space that I work in, and then also the leasing. And I think it's fair to say the leasing has slowed down significantly. You know, there are still deals that are happening, but far fewer than would be typical. And so I don't think that's any surprise or really any secret. I think on the advisory side, we are continue to actually be quite busy. I think, you know, a lot of projects in the pipeline are struggling to figure, oh, you can't even see me, to figure out, how to pivot in this moment. And so I think more than ever, they're sort of receptive to alternative strategies. So, we continue to be quite busy, on the advisory side, like I said, and, leasing, I just think, it's going to take some time. But there are winners and losers. I don't want to, again, just be very negative. When we talk about retail, we have to bear in mind, grocers, bike shops, quick service restaurants, those have fared very well. Home improvement stores, those have all fared quite well. And like I said, in the neighborhoods, there have been businesses that have actually done as well or better. So it really is variable.
Can you speak a little bit more? You mentioned that you'd seen more flexibility specifically with the city of Boston. Could you maybe speak a little bit more about maybe with the city of Boston and other cities or towns that you're working in, some of that flexibility, kind of what that has looked like with those ground floor uses? Because that's always been something I've been very curious about. I know others have.
Yeah, I mean, right now I think it's done on by a case by case basis, which is not the way you want to do it, right? And so, that would require a wholesale change to the zoning. But I think with developers putting increased pressure, and frankly, us too, sending that message that we need to be more flexible about zoning for the ground floor spaces, I'm hopeful that they'll get the message. As I think I mentioned earlier, they are very receptive to that, because I think that cities recognize that parts of their zoning code are very antiquated and are sort of ripe for a refresh. But frankly, cities are overtaxed, given, sort of the demands of COVID and everything else. So I'm not sure it's happening in the near term, but I think that they will do everything they can to sort of make it work. But I know that it is on their radar as something that needs to be rethought. I will say too that they have done extraordinary things. This is the city of Boston in terms of expediting permitting. I know Cambridge, Somerville, they've all done the same thing to make it easier for people to get a permit for outdoor dining, to not require it for doing all kinds of things where previously, there were all kinds of bureaucratic hurdles that you had to jump through. So I think that's all for the better, long overdue. Now that they have sort of opened this up and made it seem easy, I think that is going to make it much easier and frankly equitable for businesses in the future.
Just to follow on to that question, I'm curious. You mentioned also in your presentation, you were speaking about the kind of competition for the curbside space for retailers between delivery, pickup and drop off, curbside contactless delivery, as well as outside dining. Maybe could you speak briefly about kind of what you're seeing in terms of some of the solutions or challenges that some of these groups are facing, and maybe how they're being resolved?
Yeah, I'm not at the city anymore, so I can't actually talk with too much specificity around that. I think somebody who's really internal to the operations would have better insight on that. I will note that the city was able to make available like a 15-minute pickup parking, spot at no cost for restaurants. But what they were finding, and this is just anecdotal, that it was largely the restaurants sort of downtown that were making use of that, and not the restaurants out in the neighborhood. So, I don't know how widely it was adopted, frankly. But, now I think they've worked really hard to try and take what is a very valuable asset, the space of the street and the sidewalk and the curb, and essentially give that back to the operator for use for outdoor dining. And so I think, in terms of trying to resolve those things, I think, again, it's probably on a case-by-case basis, but I think the city has worked very hard to try and give most restaurants some kind of outdoor relief valve so that they can continue operation safely in the summer months.
Great. Let's see. Interesting question here from John Ford. So he's asking a little bit more about the curbside parking COVID urban design changes. What do you think? Are those going to be temporary or shift to long term? Do you have an opinion or heard any feedback on some of those items?
Yeah, I think that this is actually the area that is of most interest to myself too. I think that the TNC demand was sort of dramatically high pre-COVID. And so when I was back at the city, there was a lot of effort on these pilot studies to try and get to manage that demand, and so direct people to specific locations so that they wouldn't impede traffic, they weren't impacting sort of establishments around them. I think that going forward, it is going to naturally gravitate more towards issues of pickup and takeaway for food, which was not an issue anybody had anticipated. In combination with that, it might be that several restaurants are working in concert together. I can only speculate right now, but I think issues of curbside management are going to be critical. Also, because you're having to navigate across cycle tracks and, in some instances, parking lanes. And so making sure that this can be done in a safe and efficient manner is going to be very challenging.
Great, that's helpful. It looks like Lisa Jacobson has a question for you. She's curious to know if anyone is working on a study to measure the return on investment of using on-street parking for dining instead of parking. So even if paid parking, that's an interesting question. I was thinking the same thing, the economic implications of this conversation.
Yeah, Lisa, that's a great question. And I don't know the answer to that, but I'd be curious to know as well. Going back to sort of my complete street days, which some of you may recall, the city's, land holdings, 50% of that comprise their street and their streets and their sidewalks. And so, this would be of interest to them to see how can they best get a return on that, even if it isn't a direct monetary return, but these restaurants are obviously giving taxes back to the city. So I think there are a variety of ways to slice it. I think that's a super interesting question.
Absolutely. One topic that's interesting to me as well in terms of the ground floor uses and retail, the reuse of retail spaces, Corey, is this concept of last mile distribution. And I know there's been a lot kind of conversation around that. Has that come up at all in terms of your conversations with some of these different spaces? I'm just kind of curious. I know the sizes differ, but I've heard there's some smaller spaces that are being used for that type of use. Have you come across that conversation?
Yeah, actually, I just wrote something about this, that the increase in curbside pickup has grown dramatically. I think Target in the past quarter saw a 700% increase in curbside pickup. And, that is enormous because they are basically, it's a lot more profitable for these large national companies to get the consumer to solve that last mile problem for them, right? And so they just have to ship to their stores or some sort of centralized distribution facility and have the consumer come to them to pick up. What I was writing about, though, was the context of then you go to a surface parking lot or one or two dedicated spots, and that isn't really designed to accommodate a 700% increase. So I mentioned Target only because that was a dramatic statistic, but we've seen, and it's emblematic of a larger national trend. But there are several local enterprises that are doing a huge volume of sales through contactless curbside pickup. The one I mentioned is actually Cambridge Naturals, which some of you might be familiar with. And they've also embraced technology. So that has been sort of instrumental to the success of that. And so I think there is an opportunity to get creative through design of how that operation occurs, because I don't think that the cities and these establishments are sort of well set up for that.
Well, I think this was a great overview. I really appreciated some of the observations you made, and I think they were super helpful for me, and I hope I'm sure absolutely the rest of the group here. Were there any other questions from the group? We'd be happy to. We've got a couple more minutes if anyone wants to chime in here. Feel free to reach out.
I'm sorry nobody can see me at this point. My Zoom does this a couple of times, so I can see all of you though, which is nice.
Okay, we'll give it just another moment here and see if there's any other questions here. The question around economic kind of return on investment, that's an interesting one. You mentioned the twofer and the porosity of the retailers and their bringing the store out to the street and vice versa. And I wonder if there's and then you mentioned Target, but we've also been talking mostly about kind of smaller retailers and how they kind of fit together. And I wonder how analogous your 700% increase that you mentioned from Target is.
Sorry, John, you're sort of breaking up and I didn't quite hear the question.
No.
You want to ask again, or?
I think John might need to reconnect. Yeah, he's frozen. But in the meantime, if I can maybe read out a question from Logan. Logan's question is, what are some of the best practices that you're seeing for outdoor dining and ground floor activation as we kind of move into the winter months?
I mean, I think that we have to acknowledge that Boston is very cold. And so in terms of best practices, you guys probably are already familiar with them. It's using heat lamps and trying to create a windbreak. You know, Boston is really a super, super windy city. So we think about trying to create human comfort during the colder months. It's actually not so much the temperature as it is the wind. So people that are sort of thinking about that and trying to shield from the wind is preferable. But I think also people that are just thinking creatively, like Alcove, I know they're going to do some kind of like outdoor fireside, like cider or like hot chocolate bar with blankets. And so I don't think that there's necessarily one thing, but it's a variety of different sort of creative ideas to get people comfortable with the idea of sitting outside in colder weather. But I think, you know, just to be honest, it's going to get cold and it's going to be not comfortable for a lot of people to sit outside. But I really applaud the restaurants that are trying, and you know, I've done it with a heater and it's not so bad, again, depending on the wind.
So we got a note from, question from, well, they're like notes from both Lisa and Mary. Lisa, for the group, put out the winter guide for this year, and Mary, we have the last few minutes left, but would someone like to just speak up? Mary, I know you've got a suggestion here, but I can kind of open the floor if anyone would like to speak.
Yeah, I can mention this too. I had seen this, that the BSA is actually sponsoring a conversation around, they're sponsoring a Winter Places guide with ideas for how to activate the streets during the winter months. So, you know, I will also just say certain cities that are already cold, in Canada particularly, have been quite successful in getting people outdoors, predominantly through a variety of passive and active recreation, not just outdoor dining. So I think that people are very focused on dining, but again, we have to think more expansively about what's going to bring people outside. And then Mary's comment I'm seeing here now is making a pitch for clear glass. I 1000% agree with that. You know, it almost doesn't matter what's happening inside. I think people just like to look inside windows. I mean, I know that I'm probably not alone. I'm an architect, but I like to look inside residential windows. You know, you're curious about the interiors of people's homes. So that is, you know, a minimum. I know that people are concerned about energies, but there is a way to shield that. There's also obviously high visibility glass. So I completely agree. So maybe I will just wrap up just to give people a few minutes to take a bio break, because I know you're going to launch into a series of awards. So just thanks again to CNU for having me this afternoon. You know, it is really nice to just rub elbows with some people whom I don't normally see. And if you have any questions for me, I'll put my email into the chat. So feel free to reach out. I also made a plug for the Graffito podcast, so I'm going to put a link in there as well. Thank you again, and hope everybody stays healthy and sane.
Thanks, Corey. Great presentation. I'm going to turn it over to John Ford now. Sorry, I dropped off for a moment.
Thanks, John. Welcome back. Zoya picked right up. So we thought, since we're amazingly running a few minutes ahead of schedule, Corey had a good idea there. Maybe we'll take 3 or 4 minutes for folks that I'm sure hanging on every word, give you a chance to run off and come back for the awards. If it's 4:12 now, we'll take 5 minutes and start only a few minutes past our scheduled start at 4:15. We'll start at 4:17 to be precise. So take a few minutes, get a drink, facilities, and we'll see you at 4:17 for the 2020 Urbanism Awards. All right, everyone. My clock says 4:18, so we'll get rolling. So again, my name's John Ford. I am currently president of CNU New England. Welcome to the 2020 Urbanism Awards. We are thrilled to have you all here and to learn about some really great work going on in New England. I think before we move on, I want to make sure to address Lydia Edwards was scheduled to speak in this time slot and couldn't join us this week due to circumstances. And we wish her the best. So we've shifted around. So sorry for those of you that are expecting to see Lydia. We hope to have her back with us in the future. So on to the awards. We want to make sure to thank our sponsors before we get into the good stuff of the awards. Fitzgerald and Halliday, Horsley Witten Group, Mashpee Commons, Cornish Associates, Stevens Associates, Principal, Robinson and Cole, and Pew Management. So for us, as the local chapter of a national organization, really the reason that the chapters exist and were started in the first place was to help realize what national think tank policy initiatives, design, trends, and what does that mean for us in New England? What is new urbanism in New England? And I think that really one of the best things we can do locally is to help shine a spotlight on those of you doing great work here in New England and how special and innovative and distinctive that work is and what new urbanism means to us, which is especially important these days, obviously in 2020, with those of you forging ahead with great work. And really what we do is being rethought in a lot of ways. So for us, dedicated to creating and sustaining places that people love has more meaning than ever. So we hosted the 2020 Urbanism Awards. We had more entries than we've ever had, which is, we're really thrilled to see that. I'll introduce the jury in just a minute and a little about how we evaluated these projects. Really the heart of what we're looking for is work that embodies the principles of the charter, both the response and the design excellence, a range of principles, and ability to impact local places, social, environmental, economic perspective. We added on to that kind of some bonus points in terms of innovation, work that we kind of haven't seen before, and we want to help spread the word about that. Work that's been implemented and getting stuff done, we had bonus points for. We like to see work built, adopted, implemented. And this year we added a new category, and really we're looking for projects that help express social and cultural diversity and variety, which obviously has always been important to us new urbanists, and even more so now. Here you see the jury, which is a subset of the New England chapter board. And I want to thank the jury for a really quick turnaround to take what was more entries than we expected, which is wonderful, process those and come down to the 5 projects that we will be awarding for 2020 Urbanism Awards. So Matt, George, Zoya, Jacinda, Manny, thank you for joining me as part of the jury this year. And so with that, what I'm going to do is hand it back to Zoya to present the awards, and we look forward to hearing about it and hearing from those that have received awards this year. Zoya.
Sure. So I just want to start off with it's been an absolute honor and learning experience to be on a jury, to kind of really get to know and learn about some fantastic projects, some of which just slip through your periphery. You just get so stuck doing your own work, or especially with COVID times, not traveling around or meeting as many folks. So being on the jury was a purely selfish act for me, just to know and learn about some fantastic projects that are coming up around New England. So with that, I'd like to start the first award, which was for the category of region. And the award goes to Vision Haverhill 2035. And the award team was led by UTIL, submitted the award, the City of Haverhill, and Inigret Partners. The jury as a team was pretty unanimous in believing that the project addressed every aspect of continued development of a gateway city. The project was great in adhering the charter principles. It brought together all the principles of addressing economy, open space, mobility, housing, as well as historic resources. And we really appreciated the project's approach in targeting density and industry development side by side, which are often just looked at as not being symbiotic missions. And so with that, I request the folks from the winning team if they'd like to come say a few words.
Yes, hi there. My name is Will Cohen. I work at UTIL. I guess what I would say is we found that this project was primarily enabled by the strong support from, a combination of the planning department, the planner William Pillsbury at Haverhill, the city council, and the mayor all together. They encouraged a robustly paced, fast initiative that gave us the cover to promote far-reaching changes, which allowed us to have a good community process that could have frank conversations with residents. That then let us create a plan, which we hope at least, provides the guidance needed for the city to implement those changes. So our lesson here was that good leadership from the city allowed us to, do our job as well as we could for them. Thank you very much.
Well, congratulations to you folks. I apologize. This is a little unusual way of giving awards. I would have liked to have a more robust round of applause from everyone, but it's a virtual applause.
I'll imagine it. Yeah, thanks.
I'd like to move on to the category of neighborhood, district, and corridor. And the award was actually shared by two teams. They were just two fantastic, and we just felt that they took very different problems and brought two very different innovative solution skill sets to address them. And so there are two awardees. The first one goes to the Washington Street Vision Plan, led by a team led by the principal group, Street Plan Urban Advisors, Kittleton Associates, Tischler Bice, and M.I. Keller Moore Architects. As a project, we just thought this project is the right project at the right time. For a city that has historically been quite autocentric, though being just a few miles from Boston downtown, and a city that has primarily initially been resistant, kind of reluctant to grow. And so the project bringing on more housing opportunities as well as walkable communities was something that we all found was quite commendable. And so I'd like to request someone to say a few words.
Thank you. So representing Principal Group, we're very honored for receiving this award. Washington Street was a very exciting project that allowed us to tackle both the vision plan and a code, which is a very special opportunity for any planning firm. We, of course, want to be very thankful for Mayor Fuller and Barney Heath, the plan director of the city of Newton, and the residents, business owners, and students that help crafting this plan. Because the city was a very supportive and echoing what the team from UTIL just said, having a supporting leadership in these type of plans is key. We approached this by opening a pop-up office over there, so we could hear from the community in a more intense way, having constant charrettes with them. And I think the fact that the plan got approved already, and we're still waiting for the form-based code, is a testament of the work that the community put together. So thank you very much.
Moving on to the other awardees in this group, the award goes to the Downtown Danbury TOD study led by a team of Goody Clancy, VHB, and WZHA. We appreciate the fact that the plan worked with a city's growing diverse demographics. The project addressed the city's growing Latinx community to address a stronger, more transit-centric downtown, while managing to promote locally owned business and civic life to kind of create the backbone force for the neighborhood revitalization. And so I request the winning team members.
Hi, I'm Sharon Calitro. I'm the planning director for the city of Danbury. And on behalf of the city and our consultant team led by Ben Carlson and Goody Clancy, he's on the call as well. My task force made up of members of the community, vested members of the community, and my department staff. I'm really honored to receive this award, and I thank the awards jury. In receiving the award, I think we, CNU has recognized that for Danbury, and I hope for other municipalities, that by focusing on downtown land use, transit options, public spaces. Oh, I don't know if I got bumped out.
Keep going.
Okay, sorry. So by focusing on our downtown, our transit options, public spaces, and our culturally rich and diverse and growing community, we can create places where people want to live and work and shop and study and play. So thanks again, and I'll just turn it over to Ben to say a few words. And thank you to Goody Clancy, and that was a great team.
I'll just wrap it up by saying what was really fun during this process was watching downtown's many stakeholders really rediscover the assets they have, the streets, the blocks, the businesses, and especially the people, and really the increasingly diverse community of residents and business owners around Danbury, who really are helping really represent a new definition of downtown. So I think great things will come of that. Thank you.
Congratulations, folks. I'd like to move on to our third category, which was block, street, or building. And it was interesting to note this category had a lot of entries, and this is the first time that this is also being shared by two groups, and they're addressing one project addresses like the blocks and the streets, as opposed to going with the project that was more of a building focus. And I think it also just spoke to the fact of how community engagement definitely featured strongly this year in the projects as well as the conversations being raised. So the first awardee are the Community Resiliency by Design, led by Union Studio and the Cape Cod Commission. This is a fantastic project, and we appreciated the fact that Union Studio also shared the complete documentation that they had made for form-based codes for the Cape Cod Commission. We are going to be putting all the awardees on the website if folks wanted to take more look at the projects or just know more about some of the work that went into these. So you can all take a look at that. And so this project, we thought it addressed a critical need of designing and implementing affordable housing while maintaining or reinforcing the critical need of a community that strengthens neighborhood. And the project brought much needed the missing middle housing to local community, and allowed for new housing topologies that were consistent with the existing village character, addressed our charter principles, and most importantly, are actually implementable by local governments. And they also brought about the suggestion, as I mentioned, of form-based codes to bring these housing types into the zone. And it's kind of heartening to see that many communities are now considering this approach. And so I request the team to say a few words.
Thanks, Zoya. My name is Jeremy Lake. I just want to share a few quick acknowledgements on behalf of Union Studio. First of all, thank you to the board of CNU New England for putting on this summit and these awards. Keep up the good work. Thanks also to the jury for recognizing this effort among what I'm sure a host of deserving projects. A big thank you to the Cape Cod Commission for serving as both our client and really our partner in this effort. We definitely couldn't have done this without them. We also wanted to thank the planning staffs of the towns of Barnstable, Eastham, Falmouth, Orleans, and Sandwich for hosting these discussions in their communities. And last but not least, thanks to the residents of those communities who came out back when it was okay to come out to provide their much needed input. So thank you very much.
Congratulations, folks. The other award being shared in this community goes to the Parkville Market, led by a team of Life Care Design, the Outfitters, Parkville Management Consultants, Beta Inc., and Aztec Engineers. This project, we felt, really embodies, is the kind of project that triggers transformation. This was an amazing example of repurposing existing industrial buildings to serve as a neighborhood hub. They brought together the residents in it brings the residents of a neighborhood in a common meeting place while reinforcing a walkable community. And we appreciated the inclusive and diverse nature of the cuisine and price points, that it's every aspect of the project, from the design nature, but also the programming of it, really strengthened its welcoming nature to the community at large. And so I request the team to say a few words. Is there anyone from the Life Care team? That's okay. We will send them their virtual congratulations and awards.
I see them there. Is that Natalie? Unmuted? Maybe we just can't hear you.
Oh.
Hello, I think Natalie is on, but maybe she can't get her microphone to work. But I do want to say the Life Care Design team, I worked under them, was really incredible. The city, we had the support. And the owners of the building, Parkville Management Consultants, 25-year residents. He grew up in that area. He believed in that area. And with it being the first food hall in Connecticut, it's really revitalized a section of Hartford that really needed it. So on behalf of Life Care Designs and Beta, Aztec, and myself, the Outfitters, we want to say thank you for this award. Much appreciated.
And with that, I think, John, I'm going to turn it back to you to take to the next section of the awards.
Okay. So as we move forward, or before we move forward, I want to make sure to thank thank everyone for submitting this year, and give my congratulations on behalf of CNU New England and the jury to the 5 winners. As I said before, we had a record number of submissions, and the overall quality was outstanding. So that is a great statement for these projects, and an especially great statement for urbanism in New England. So as we move forward, the next award and the last award is a special one. We've done this a few times. It's Urbanist of the Year. So this award goes to someone who has provided exemplary contributions to the chapter. So we're a local chapter of a national organization. We're all volunteer. We have a history of bootstrapping and making stuff happen out of drinks and napkin sketches. So it takes a lot of sweat equity to make this work. And we want to make sure to acknowledge someone within the chapter that we wouldn't be here together today if it weren't for her contributions over the last year and beyond. So the Urbanist of the Year for 2020 is Logan Capone, who I'm not sure is actually on this call, but we at the moment. I know she had to step away. Carlos, I'm not sure if you know, or others, if she's on at the moment. But we
Oh,
tried
that'd be,
to
give me a sec.
yeah.
I've been trying to pull her back. She had a quick call to take, so she stepped away.
This is the life
Hi
of
guys, sorry, I'm on another Zoom call. I'm on Zoom.
yeah, this is the life of an urbanist in 2020 right now.
Yeah, it's a new low of quarantine here. But thank you.
Well, Logan, we wanted to recognize your efforts over the last year, which really have been above and beyond. You showed up, and it has been noticed by everyone around you, and we appreciate it. You rock, and
Thank you, I appreciate
continue
it.
to do so. So Logan Capone, thank you. We will get in touch with you. If we were all together, I would be handing you a gift certificate for Urbanism books, which I know we all love. So we'll connect with you on that as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jacinda for the next part of our program.
All right. Hi, everybody. So we're a little ahead of schedule, and we're going to wait. I think we should wait for our panelists to show up, and it'll be a way better conversation that way. So we have, I think, 5 minutes before our official start time. So if everybody wants to take another bio break or just stretch their legs for a minute, I'll come back in about 5 minutes exactly and start with the introductions, and then we'll go on into a really great discussion on housing innovation. Thank you.
Hey, Russ. Can you hear us? We're on break.
Yeah, I thought I was having tech issues.
You arrived at a strangely silent
Yeah, I was like, wow.
portion of the meeting. Russ
Wait.
is here, Eric's here, Monique is here. We're just giving it a couple minutes between the awards and the panel.
All right, cool.
Nice.
So as we're in between, I just want to put another plug in for the social hour starting at 5:30 with SNEPA. We are joining forces with SNEPA. We'll leave this Zoom. We'll put the link in the chat, and you just click on that link and you'll get your own link to join the happy hour with SNEPA. Kind of like walking from here to the bar. If we were in our social hall, it's the virtual version of that. We'll walk from one Zoom to the other, get your drink on the way.
All right, I think we're close enough to 4:45. We can go ahead and start. I'm too excited to wait. So as has been mentioned earlier this afternoon, Lydia Edwards was originally scheduled to talk to us today about some of her housing policies that she's trying to push forward in the city, as well as to talk about Suffolk Downs and some of the ways that they're working very diligently now to try to make sure that the development process is both inclusive as well as the resulting and built environment will allow for continued diversity and affordability. So with that, we want to keep the focus. We really thought it was a really important topic to keep focusing on in the space of innovative housing policy and what we can do as urbanists to kind of push that agenda as we go forward in our work, not only work in the built area, but the policy side as well to help ensure the results that we're designing for. And with that in mind, we have a really excellent panel that has stepped in at the last minute for us. They're not only incredibly knowledgeable on the topics and dedicated to furthering these kinds of policies for productive, positive change. They're also wonderful human beings for stepping in at this late hour to help us with this discussion. So thank you very much. We really appreciate you joining us all today, and we're excited to hear the conversation. Our moderator today is Monique Gibbs. She's a policy innovation associate at MassHousing. Prior to that, she's worked at both MAPC and in the City of Boston's Housing Innovation Lab. And she's going to be talking with two of our panelists, Eric Halvorsen, Vice President and Principal of RKG Associates, and Russ Preston, Founder and Director of Principal Group. We're keeping the introductions super short and sweet so that we can hear a really good conversation. So Monique, the floor is yours virtually.
Hi,
thank
everyone.
you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, first Jacinda, for extending the offer for me to participate in this event. I've brought myself up a lot, or I've informed myself a lot about your organization in the last 3 days, and I'm really excited to join you all today. And yesterday we had kind of like a preview of this conversation, so I'm really excited to really share this with you all, because I think all three of us are really smart people, but I think you all are probably even smarter, and collectively we can make some really great change in the urban design and development area, and change that we really need to see in this space. So since Jacinda started us off with really good introductions, I'm going to start with some framing questions. So first, in recent years, community participation and its impact on development has increased and evolved. Will Russ or Eric, can you speak to the challenges and benefits of participatory planning for the future of housing development?
Russ, do you want me to start off? Or?
Sure.
Okay. It's a great question, and one that always ends up surfacing, especially around housing. But I mean, I'm pretty sure I don't tell anybody on this panel who's listening in about the challenges of public participation when it comes to housing. I guess particularly in the communities that view housing from more of an adversarial point of view. And I don't know if you all had a chance to read Amy Dane's report that came out, I think within the last year or so,
but she wrote an entire report on this topic and how much more time consuming the planning and permitting process can actually become if opponents are well organized and if they have the ears of the permitting bodies. You know, like worst case scenario is often your project doesn't get approved and you spend a lot of time and money on something that essentially ends up going nowhere. Best case, maybe your development program gets knocked down by a few units and you have to spend a little more money for architect fees or your attorney. I think this is more often the case in suburban communities, but honestly, we're even seeing it in bigger cities like Boston, you know, which of course there in Boston, the reasons for opposition vary quite a bit. It's not just opposition to housing, but it might be, you know, in opposition to the level of affordability or the types of units or where the housing is located. So it's kind of a nuanced discussion depending on the community that you're in. And I think, but on the plus side, because I think we do tend to dwell on the negative when it comes to housing and public participation, but on the plus side, public participation, I think, can really help tell the nuanced story of the lived experiences in a community and the people who live there, and really help relate the development back to the needs of the community. One example, as I was thinking about this question, it's not about a specific development, but more about the process. I think it was last year, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council was working on a housing production plan for Salem, and they took a really interesting and I thought innovative approach where they produced a series of videos on different housing topics, but they chose to tell the story through the lived experiences of residents and even the public officials in the city. I thought it was just a great example of how we can use the residents who are in one zone community to illustrate what are often very complicated issues and sort of how housing is such a critical link to everyday life.
So the question was interesting because there's always challenges, but I like to go into any public process with what do we not know that we're going to learn. And I think we always forget about why we include the public. And you know, whenever we leave a public meeting, I always ask our team, okay, what did we learn? What's new about what we experienced in that we can incorporate into the project, or whether it's planning or housing or a building, you know. And I think that's what I think we often lose sight about, is that we're given an opportunity to open up a dialogue with a place and talk about the future. And how often, I mean, especially in these times we're all living in right now, can we talk about the future in a positive way that we can actually affect positive change? And I think recently I've been reflecting more and more on this, that we have a unique chance in these discussions if we can get the psychology to a place where it's not adversarial, that it's actually a constructive and collaborative conversation that's happening. People are going to have different opinions, but it's about the fact that they all are sort of, well, let's go there and we're going to disagree on some stuff, but let's keep going and working on it. And I think if we can get the psychology right in any public process, whether it's around housing or it's around any number of topics that this group deals with, then I think we have an opportunity as the facilitators of that to actually connect dots between different people's thoughts and minds. And those people in that community may have never shared those ideas with one another. And that's the pattern recognition that we're always trying to look for. And I know in a process, if we continue the public process throughout our planning, at a certain point, we've built up enough of those connections and enough of those shared experiences that we can we have had conversations with people and we can connect those dots where they were never able to do that in their community before. And I think that's a reflection on like the common. We don't have places in our community anymore where people just bump into each other and randomly start talking about, well, how do we make this better? So I think that's part of, you know, our aspirations, I think, as new urbanists, is to create that common where we can have these better conversations. So I think these challenges can be overcome. We've just got to make sure that we get everyone in the right headspace to help us solve them.
Thank you for that. And just as a follow-up to that, I know that you both do work in different states in New England and across the country. What's it like communicating housing and development in different markets and for different populations? So in my experience working with the city of Boston and work in MassHousing, a conversation that we're going to have about housing development in the Fields Corner neighborhood of Dorchester is very different from the conversation that we're going to have in West Roxbury. And even just the people who participate in those conversations can be very different.
Do you mean besides density and parking?
Yeah. Those are always big.
I think, you know, a lot of our work in the last really 4 or 5 years has been either in, I would say for this group, a Transect Zone 5 or 6, transit served, very mixed use, very walkable places in and around Boston, or polar opposite, rural Maine, where you might have a corner store and a sort of little bit of something in the town center, but otherwise rural. And it comes back to me time and time again. It's about housing market. We don't have enough housing. Even in rural Maine, in Oxford County, we have 2 projects going up there right now. We don't have enough housing for our any income level, and I think, especially if folks in sort of, lower and middle incomes, there's just not enough housing. So that's the same conversation we're having, I think, in parts of Boston. So it's fascinating to me that overall issue is throughout New England, I've experienced it. And I think when you bring it down to the sort of block or street level, I think that's when it gets difficult, because people are fine about, we need more housing, but it really does come down to, I don't want that tall housing in my backyard. And I think there's a fundamental issue with how we think about housing. And I think we've disconnected it from whether you're in a rural community or you're in a center city neighborhood, that we're trying to create neighborhoods that are open and inviting to all. And I think when we're making these individual choices at the sort of nitpicky level of the block, we have to be cautious, because we're losing sight of things that could create a more robust, more interesting, more fulfilling community for folks that already live there. And I just don't think we've explained that well enough, where we're just always talking about density and where the trash is and how the loading is going to work, and is it going to be affordable, and can my son or daughter live there? So I think that's an opportunity that we need to further explore.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like, Russ, you're complimenting probably me. You're down at the street and the site level. And we're usually the ones, I think, who are coming in before you're coming in, and we're sort of setting that stage and saying, here's why you need more housing, and sort of the reasons why and what types of housing. And then you're sort of coming in, behind us, I'm sure as many other folks on the call are too, actually building what's needed. And we used to talk about housing in one way, and I've tried to pivot a little bit more to trying to figure out what people can relate to, or maybe hopefully what they can sort of empathize with as we're thinking about housing, because there's so many people in each of the communities, whether it's an urban environment like Boston or rural Maine. There are people who are struggling with different housing challenges and different housing issues. So I think what we try to do is to uncover them through the data, as well as through the interviews that we do throughout the process, and try to tell that story, and try to see if we can get people in the community who may have been adversarial before to really understand what the housing needs are, the people who live here today and those people who might be coming in the future, and then try to set the stage that way at a community-wide level for then the people who, whether it's a nonprofit developer, the housing authority, or a market rate developer, to come in and actually begin to fill those gaps and fill those needs.
All right, well, thank you for that.
Can I follow up on that real quick? When you say that, though, at the high level, is that getting into like the differences at a design level between family housing and housing for aging seniors? Because I think this housing needs assessment, sort of, a number of communities have done these recently and all, and I just don't think we're focusing enough on that. And this gets to, I think, something that's really core to CNU's mission, is this idea of a variety of building types that hit many different price points and serve many different types of people. And I think especially in the sort of builder market and developer market we're in New England, it's, can I get a podium and 1/4 or 1/5, or, and those building types deliver to a certain type of home that only a certain swath of the market wants. And I think that's part of it too, is we go into planning activities and it's sort of like, oh, we'll do a market study. Do you know what housing you need? Oh, no, we don't. We don't know what our community needs for housing in the next 10 years. I think that's something that we could fix, is every community should figure out, where's our demographics going? Who are we attracting? What kind of housing is the best for them to call home?
Yep. Yeah, that's what we tried to do, Russ, to the best of our ability. Yeah. I was mentioning an example. Monique, you can tell me to be quiet if we need to move on, please. But we were talking yesterday about the planned Mattapan neighborhood in Boston, and we were doing the data work for that. And we were trying to figure out what makes that neighborhood unique and what are the unique housing needs that they have versus maybe other neighborhoods of Boston or the city as a whole. And just two examples that we pulled out were multi-generational households, and then how does the actual housing unit or the structure, the actual structure that has the units in it, how does that need to be adapted from what was being built for the last 200 years to what families actually need going forward? And then the other one was around single parent households. There's a higher percentage of single parent households in Mattapan than there are in other neighborhoods of Boston or the city as a whole. And so what are the needs of those households? So when we went out and engaged the community in the discussion around housing, we had very pointed questions that we asked the community. Said, are you living in a household like this, or do you have friends or family who live in a household like this? And what do they need from a housing perspective, or even from a neighborhood community development perspective, that they can't find here today? And how can we use this planning process to help them get what they need?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To add to both of your points, I think when it comes to housing planning and understanding what communities need, it depends on why the community is doing those housing plans. So, and how are they required to do those housing plans? So in Massachusetts, it's usually related to like 40B or some type of major zoning change or requirement. In the case of Mattapan in Boston, one of the reasons why the BPDA chose to do Plan Mattapan is in response to all the planning and the stresses of displacement and development happening in some communities, in Mattapan being pretty much left behind, creating a plan that was very proactive to encourage development and encourage more participatory development within those communities, which I think will hopefully lead to better action in the years to come. Which I think is a good segue to our next question. So as we all know, we currently live in a COVID era. That's why we're all virtual right now and not in somebody's conference room or something like that, sipping tepid water. But COVID has had a dramatic effect on the way that we work, we live, we interact with each other, all these different types of things. And I feel that there were a lot of housing and development trends that were pre-COVID, and really like to hear your thoughts on what do you anticipate seeing in our housing development after COVID, and what will be left behind? Because I think micro units, I think they were very exciting and a lot of people really like them, but I would be surprised if 10 years down the line, we're going to see more micro units, but I could be wrong, because who knows?
I mean, I'll just talk about two kind of trends that I'm trying to keep my eye on. One is sort of COVID's impact on migration, really from sort of urban locations, density locations, to other nearby cities and towns. And I am not in the camp of, cities are dead, everyone's going to leave because of COVID. I do not believe that is going to happen. But I do think some percentage of residents who were living in urban areas are looking for something else, or now realize that they can work from home, and the cost of housing 30 or 45 minutes outside of the center city is a lot less, and they can get more house, or maybe they can even afford to buy a house versus living in Boston or Providence or Portland. I've always thought about the possibility of not having Boston in particular being sort of the center of the world, and everything is this sort of hub and spoke system, but instead utilizing our perimeter cities, gateway cities, smaller towns to fill niche roles where companies could have satellite branches or shared office space, sort of making people's commutes easier, and then trying to connect them digitally like we're doing today. I think that would have a huge impact on housing, and potentially mean that more places outside the urban cores need to really seriously consider how they might accommodate that additional growth, and then the amenities and services that new residents might actually need. The other thing, probably more pressing right now than say a couple months ago, I think we need to be paying close attention to evictions, nationwide foreclosures, and what might happen if more large real estate companies continue to buy up owner-occupied housing and turn them into rentals. I think we're quickly becoming a nation of renters, and that has long-term impacts on wealth creation, stability, sense of belonging to a place, and not to mention affordability if you're sort of at the whims of a large real estate conglomerate. So those are things that I think COVID is probably escalating the pace of.
Thank you. Russ?
Yeah, I think COVID is like a time warp. I think there's these trends that were beginning that I think we're maybe 5 or 6 years out that are right in front of us now. And who would have thought this many parklets would be deployed? I mean, it was 10 years ago that's, Mike Lydon and a handful of other new urbanists coined the term tactical urbanism. So, I remember, just a year ago, we were fighting over parklets in Boston, and now they're everywhere. So I think there's some, in our office, we've been talking about how to make lemonade out of this whole experience. And I think what I've been reading a lot lately is about other, at points in time, we've had pandemics before. And I think we're kind of converging on the solution that the Italians landed on. The piazza, the outdoor dining, the big open windows, the terraces. There are all these things that I think we just have to look at older cultures and older building traditions. And those were maybe not necessarily design implications. Those were things that were reactions to human experiences. I think that's something where I go, I haven't been to our office downtown since March. And, it has no open windows, it has no terraces. It's disconnected from the life of the city. I think that's something as new urbanists we've talked a lot about, but now we've had this whole collective shared experience about how important neighborhoods are. And I think that's number one on my list of, okay, this is something that we have solutions to that we're just rediscovering. And I think this goes to like, all right, every house is connected to a street. And now you go outside and you look at how people are really being creative about how we use streets now. So I think we're out of Pandora's box. And I think we should be really talking heavily about housing and pedestrian safety and how all of these street issues we've been dealing with are now directly connected to our health and welfare of the people that are living or working on the streets. So I think that's an opportunity and a trend that I think, a number of cities have already said they're not going to get rid of their parklets. They can just put them back up next year. And then I think at the micro level, like a landing pad, this little thing that in the residential design world it's just a little desk. Like this idea that in apartments, you have a landing pad where you can put your laptop, where you're not sitting on your couch. Like I've had a number of discussions with mostly residential design architects recently about saying, okay, how can we reconfigure every single apartment unit type so that there's a landing pad or there's some type of, you've got a 1 bedroom, but you have a little walk-in closet so someone can work in the closet and be on a Zoom call and someone can work in their bedroom. Like there's crazy things being talked about at the unit level that actually I think makes the units better. And it's one of those things where I think, how dare us be able to deliver housing that actually was not comfortable to human experiences and not serving some of these needs that I think prior to maybe the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, we were doing this. We were working at home. We were running businesses out of our home. I think we're going back to a lot of those traditions, and we just happen to have to discover them through this incredibly difficult pandemic world.
Okay. So I think from what you're saying is that with COVID, we kind of need to have an eye. We need to have one eye to the back and one eye to the front, so we understand where we're going. And I think for our next question, I would say that we need to really keep that same philosophy as we move forward. So in addition to COVID, our country has been forced to reckon with decades of systemic racial discrimination and inequities that have been heightened through COVID and all the economic issues and the health-related issues that have come through COVID. And housing plays a very important role in racial equity. So how is your organization working to, address racial, systemic racism in housing for your current as well as future projects?
I would say that it's always been a part of our projects, but for me personally, with everything that's been going on, over the last 8, 10, 12 months nationwide, I think it's really pushed me personally to think even more about the work that we're doing and how we can uncover and daylight the real issues around the things that are impacting people and households of color. When we start our analysis for a housing study, we're always looking at things like differences in median household income, housing tenure, the structure of households, poverty statistics, even employment and occupations, all by race and ethnicity. And I think that in order to address the underlying issues, we have to first figure out, if they do exist in a community, what the issues are. And then even in some cases within a community, like looking geographically and figuring out where they're taking place, because oftentimes they are concentrated in some parts of a community or a county or a region and not in others. So you need to figure out why that is. And right now we're working on housing plans in places like Detroit, Toledo, Ohio, Colorado, South Dakota, and even places nearby in Nashua, New Hampshire, for example. And I can tell you that in every single one of those places, the median household income of a white household is anywhere from 2 to 3 times higher than Black, American Indian, and Hispanic Latino households. And from my perspective, that has serious implications, not just on housing, but also on all the different things that households spend money on, from childcare, education, transportation, healthcare. I think housing, it's one layer, and it is a very important one, but I think until we can address the others, namely economic disparities, it's going to be hard to address the other issues around affordability, increasing home ownership, wealth creation and accumulation, absent deep subsidies. I think it's sort of, those things are all either working together or against each other. And, we try our best to consider the interconnectivity of all those different issues when we're looking at housing, but also when we're doing things like community master plans or economic development strategies. I think it's really important to think about how all those different issues are connected, and then how they're oftentimes disproportionately impacting people of color.
This has been a conversation, I was on the national CNU board for a number of years, and, talking about equity, talking about issues of displacement, there's no perfect solution I think we have as urbanists. So our office has kind of landed on the fact that zoning came out of redlining and was related to parts of the systemic racism that we've been talking about in our country for the last few months. And our office is committed to trying making zoning either go away or be able to be reformed to a point where we actually have the ability to implement good projects and build good neighborhoods. I think for us, just looking at the regulatory environment, its inability to deliver the types of housing that we need, and the fact that we can really only deliver one type of housing, whether it's this large lot single family or it's a multifamily, and that costs, depending on where you are, it could cost almost $400,000 per unit to build. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to be able to build units for $30,000. We need to be able to build units for 45, 145, throughout the spectrum. And I think zoning is directly related to that. And we had a big discussion about this a couple years ago when we were doing the Washington Street corridor plan for Newton, and that the missing middle discussion is not about density. It's actually about providing housing at different price points. You can build a backyard bungalow way cheaper than you can build a mixed-use project on your main street. So if your community is saying, well, we want more affordability, well, are you providing all of these different opportunities to build missing middle housing that can be delivered at price points that are, sometimes not even subsidized? It can just deliver naturally occurring affordable housing. We don't do that anymore. And that goes back to, I think, this idea of a mixed use neighborhood. It's mixed, it's everyone, it's every price point, it's every, you've got people who work in the neighborhood and people who own the companies all living in the same neighborhood. And there's issues with that throughout history. But I think it's the idea that we're still connected as a community. And I think that our experience in Mission Hill has been so great because we were committed to a long process, and we were committed to getting to know the neighborhood. And most of our ground floor retail tenants are owned by minority, either people of color or women. And I think that was something that it didn't occur to us until earlier this year that, wow, That just happened. How did that happen? Well, it came through the community. We spent enough time there that the people we had as friends or tenants invited their friends, and it just happened to be they were a person of color. Said, "Open your business here. This is great." And we had, after we got into this in this last phase of the project, we had a few politicians sort of say, just don't bring in a Starbucks or a Tate or something that's going to make this not feel like this neighborhood. And I think that's so important, that we've lost these builder developers who actually know the community so well that they know what they can, shouldn't do, what they can do, what they bring to, or they become so friendly with the people who are in the community already that they, oh yeah, go work with this person. And you know, I think that's what we're kind of missing, is that community level piece. Yeah. You've got, I mean, Eric brought this up, you know, we've got huge real estate companies that are so disconnected where sometimes you're just a line item in a spreadsheet. And we're dealing with this right now with some of our national retail tenants. You know, we're just a line on the spreadsheet, and we just have to work out a deal with you for this, you know, lease. And I think we need to, as an organization, figure out if we're going to really address these societal issues, it's got to be at a community level. And we have to have good functioning neighborhoods to do that. Yeah.
When my boss often talks about like housing policy and the need for mixed income housing, she often says that, in the example, using the Seaport example, it's a disservice to the neighborhood where the person that is serving coffee, is making coffee for the workers in the morning, or preparing that lunch and stuff like that, has to travel 40 minutes to get to that job. And what does that do for the workers, the people who live within that community, the workers, and as well as the folks who are traveling? And that's really that disconnect. And you create, and I think that's where we see some of those adversarial feelings about development now, because we've seen such great divides within our communities, and they just keep growing deeper and deeper and deeper. So, which kind of leads to my next question. So before COVID, before our summer of social unrest and these conversations that we've been able to have in more depth over the last few months, housing has always been a challenge, or housing has been a consistent challenge for at least before I even came into this industry. And some of those challenges came around displacement, high construction costs, building housing for the middle, which we've already talked about. I think we now kind of have to add COVID and racial equity to those already mounting problems. So thinking about strategies, if you haven't mentioned them already, to address some of these challenges that you're experiencing, or that we're experiencing in the urban development community.
I think Russ talked about a couple of really good ones. Missing middle. You know, I think ADUs can serve a lot of different purposes. I think that's a really interesting development typology to think about. The idea, I think, of changing zoning in predominantly single-family areas, as Russ was mentioning, to allow different housing types, try and deliver that housing at more affordable price points, I think is great. And then there's always, you know, the widely accepted inclusionary zoning, inclusionary housing policies, things like that. But when I was thinking a little bit more about this question, I also don't think there's been enough around partnerships and building partnerships across different organization types that could help to address housing issues. I think a lot, maybe not, I think more could be done around bringing together, say, the municipality or a group of municipalities, nonprofits, CDFIs, developers, employers, et cetera, and getting everyone around the table to think about housing and try to solve this challenge. And I'm not from New England, so I feel, you know, I know if you're not here for like 40 years, you haven't been born here, you don't know, you know, New England. But in my 10 years or so that I've been in Massachusetts, and I worked all over, and it just seems to me to be a little bit more challenging here in New England, where regionalism doesn't seem to be quite as common as in some other places. So it really becomes this municipally driven approach to solving one's own housing issues, or whatever the issue might be. And I can tell you that housing is not an issue that starts and stops at someone's municipal boundary. People move all over the place. They move in and out of cities and towns all the time for a variety of reasons. So to me, it seems like the regional approaches to housing that include, you know, this multitude of partners, and also a multitude, hopefully, of funding sources, I think is really the only way we're ever going to solve these challenges. And I know that's not a specific strategy, but I really think we need to think a lot more about, you know, who's around that table and what role can each of those different organizations or people play in solving these housing challenges.
I think hospitals have been really stepping up and have been really thinking innovative about this. I know BNC made a big announcement for some work that they're going to be doing in like the Lower Roxbury South End community and becoming, well, equity investors in housing development, because they're seeing so many of their repeat patients come in constantly, and a lot of their underlying issues is the lack of affordable housing. So hospitals, I also know that in my role in MassHousing, we've had some conversations with some like regional Chamber of Commerce, so thinking the South Shore Chamber of Commerce, because they want to be a competitive industry, and they're saying like, oh, where people are building out the 495 and that type of stuff, but they need more housing in that area, and trying to figure out how to make sure that, trying to bring those people to the table. So I'm seeing more, I guess, private actors dragging government along to the table, or inviting government along to the table, which has had some really innovative solutions come from that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a great point.
Yeah. So I like to wrap up conversations like this with a magic wand question. So if you could wave a magic wand and enact a policy, or, you know, be given a bottomless pit of money, how would you use that to address New England's housing challenges? I'll get started with Russ.
I mentioned the zoning earlier, but I think the tradition, maybe it's home rule tradition, I'm not sure, but I just think our regulatory environment, even on the simplest of housing projects, is always a hurdle. So I think first I'd wave that magic wand and figure out how to get better community developed zoning, or something else that serves our collective sort of health and well-being around how we build out our neighborhoods changed. And I think so many communities, small, throughout New England, struggle with this, and it comes down to, I think, the uncertainty. And this is probably the second part of this, is the uncertainty around growth and around building. And I think this is, a new urbanist friend of ours, Ian Rasmussen, always says, since when did going to a party become a bad thing? Like, building cities and neighborhoods used to be fun. It used to be part of like establishing a neighborhood and building civic monuments and doing these things for a community. And now all of a sudden you can barely do anything without a special permit or a trip to the zoning board. And I think there's distrust in that process, and that's going to take time to heal. And I think, so I think this gets to the third part of this, is training. And I think this is part of an issue of our industry, is we don't have enough people in the industry that reflect the communities that need this skill set. And I think more people trained as developers, as urbanists, as planners, as people that can actually help affect change at a neighborhood level is so important. And I think that's been something that, we were writing about this issue 15 years ago. So we need a magic wand, I think, to really get that one.
Well, to respond to that, as a person of color who's really young, and I'm constantly trying to explain to people what I do and who I work for and what it is and how I got into this industry is very exclusive. That oftentimes especially when it comes to developers, it's usually a family connection. It's often a very good old boys club. We definitely don't learn about urban design in a K through 12 education example, or even really an undergrad level, because I didn't really understand. When I was an undergrad, I majored in public policy because I was like, oh, I'm gonna work in government, impact people, help my people. But it wasn't until I just had working in the legislator's office and that type of stuff, and understanding what zoning boards were and that type of stuff, where I kind of went into the path of community development. So I think I would charge, you for bringing that up, as well as your colleagues for saying that, to expand access and to really grow the training and encourage new professionals to come into this industry, is to really open it up and kind of break down some of those and create a more inviting table for it.
You know, it's a problem because who wants to go give up all their nights and weekends and stand and let people yell at them about stuff they don't want to see? It's a super attractive industry to go in.
Yeah.
No, but this is a big issue. I think this is a conversation that I think we could spend a whole nother hour on.
Mm-hmm. All right. I know we're close to time, so I wanted to give Eric a time to opportunity to respond.
Yeah, it was your
magic wand.
Yeah, it was a good question, but very tough question. I was thinking about it, I sort of say it in jest, but I kind of think it is, at least here in Massachusetts, at the heart of so much of the opposition that we hear. If I had a magic wand and a bunch of money, I think I might address the school systems and somehow try to put them all on the same level playing field. And I think that would have, that would have ripple effects across people's lives in so many different ways. But if we could address the fears of new people coming into the community, new kids coming in, fears of overcrowded schools and classrooms, all the things that, quite honestly, a lot of times go unfounded, but are still top of mind when people are thinking about housing. Like maybe if we could use a bunch of money or a magic wand to address the school issues, then maybe some of that housing opposition would go away. You'd still have things like traffic and, all the other fun stuff that people like to talk about. Other than that, I think trying to focus on maybe households at or below 50 or 30% of the area median income, I think is really important. There are obviously housing authorities and HUD programs that are focused on that, but in every community that we work in, there's never enough of those units that are priced affordably to households at those incomes. And I'm a pretty big believer of housing just as a given right. Everyone should have the ability to be housed in whatever manner that looks like. And we've also been doing a lot of work more recently around homelessness, and a lot of what the data has been saying to us, a lot of others probably already noticed, but this was sort of new for me, is that there's a much lower recidivism rate of people who return to the homelessness system if they can exit to permanent housing rather than exiting to some other type of temporary housing. So if we could even focus on that, I think the people who could exit to permanent housing from the homelessness system would have a much better chance at not reentering and getting back on their feet. So I would love to see an even bigger focus on the extremely low income or even the homelessness population, getting them housed in permanent housing.
Yeah, housing is an intersectional issue. It almost everybody does better when they have secure, affordable housing in almost every way. It's like better public health outcomes, better educational outcomes, better job outcomes. All of those things are almost always better if a person has access to safe, quality, affordable housing. So I cannot support that enough. And then also I 100% agree with you in having just kind of like unified education districts, because our current system further entrenches racial segregation. So it doesn't help us. Yep. So again, thank you both for joining me for this conversation. Thank you, Jacinda, for inviting me to and allowing me to speak with you all today. And I hope I didn't hold you up too much. I know your happy hour is coming up soon, so I want you guys to take time and enjoy yourselves this evening.
Thank you so much, Monique. That was an excellent discussion, and Eric and Russ for participating as well. I know I learned a lot, and I'm going to follow up with you guys all on specific points you brought up that were very fascinating to me. So thank you very much, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening too. And join us for the social hour if you want.
Before everyone logs out, copy the link in the chat for the social hour. I've gotten caught a few times not having that link.
Yep, it's in there. I'll put it in there again, right here. So we'll go grab your drink and see you over there. So closing this part of the summit, I want to thank all of you for joining and participating in the many ways that you all have participated in what is a very long and continuing dialogue about making better places in New England. It's good to see you all. Hopefully next year we'll see you in person or sooner even than that. If you have any questions, please reach out to us if you're able to make the social hour, or hopefully we'll see you over there in a few minutes. Thanks, everyone.